that optimism bias, for me, that's just one of the biggest things that affects the, as a project controller by nature for many years, your customer comes up with maybe an end date in the bid for a project. I remember on LNG terminals, somebody came along and the typical duration for an LNG terminal, when I with the company I worked with did the LNG tanks, but the whole terminal we worked on sometimes, the typical duration was 36 months. And the big tanks, massive steel in the concrete outer tanks were on the critical path. So 36 months was typical. Bids had come in and said do it in 34, and you'd maybe put a compliant bid in because you wanted to win the job, and you might have to deal with, oh God, there's LDs on though, what are we going to do about that if we're late? And you'd have to figure that out in your bid. Only a very bold contractor would go to a customer and say this job needs 36 months when the competitors are going to take it for 34. So while I was working in LNG, somebody came along with 32 months instead of 30, the default 36, a customer. And my planning engineer put 34 in, which is still shorter than the 36. And the MD said, he said, why have you shortened the schedule to the planner? Because the company weren't willing to have any debate about the reality. And the planner, with his best efforts, in the end, he had to go with the 32 months and put what looked like a good schedule. And of course, the costing goes with that as well. The customer had a budget for the job in their mind. It was lump sum, and there was only a certain price range was going to win the job. So in that scenario, with optimistic schedule, optimistic budget for the job from the ultimate client, prepared to invest, you're never going to hit your budget and schedule, likely not, if you take the job and execute it. So the risks are there. So that's why we have a bid no bid criteria. And again, those of you who work in that environment will be familiar with that. But this is just a slide that gives you some of the sort of things you need to be looking at. And again, this will need a scoring mechanism in terms of what is the project, do we know this customer, or are they someone we've never heard of? Is it a completely new bunch of venture capitalists, or is it an established client that we worked for before? Do we need to bring in a joint venture partner to deliver the scope because there are areas where it's not our company's core competency and skill set? Or can we do it on our own? How do we share that arrangement? What is the project value? What potential profit is there in that for us? Because if you're not going to make a profit or keep going to make profits on other jobs, is the customer financially stable? Lots of things. And we move into the contract itself, which is, of course, an area where often the risks will not be necessarily allocated to the organisation most best able to deal with it on a project. Depending on how that shakes out, for example, the favourite is unforeseen ground conditions. The owner ought to have the best record of that. Often there aren't any records. But that risk may often be put on the contractor. And so you have to look at, is this job too risky for us to bid? Or is it one we think we've got a reasonable chance of coming out okay on? And that final investment decision and optimism bias is reflected. One example is HS2, of course, started out as 30 billion. It's risen in steps now to 88 billion, but I believe over those years since that isn't 2020, by the way, that original cost estimate was 2010 on the first line, my apologies. But between 2010 and 2019, we've gone from 30 billion to 88. And, the actual scope of HS2 has had to be reduced as well, even in getting there. If you look at the EPR reactors in Flamanville in Finland, in France, and Olkiluoto, I can never pronounce that, in Finland, they are vastly over budget and scheduled by 3 to 5 times over for all sorts of reasons. And the track record on oil and gas projects tells a similar story without me delving too deep into the figures. And brownfield sites, for example, are a particular area where that can be quite difficult. So we come to the benefits, and in working in companies that were moving from broadening their business offering from project execution to program management, this is where I came across the topic of benefits coming up much more. But I still don't see that mentioned, understood too much. I've worked with program management where the actual guys talking about it are project managers, and so it's hard to switch them off the project to think about the program and its benefits when they've delivered it. So there's a whole mindset there as we go into that. But certainly, increasing now, we need to think about that from the get-go at the start of the project, about those benefits coming out after the project has been delivered.